Welcome to We're the We and We the People. I'm Dr. Cynthia Newton, Chair of History, Politics, and Society and Associate Professor of Political Science at Wesley College in Dover, Delaware. I'll be hosting today's program, which is entitled The U.S. Congress Structure, Membership, and Roles. Before we begin, there are a couple of things that you should know about the League of Women Voters, which is the organization sponsoring this series. The League of Women Voters is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and as such does not support or promote particular candidates or political parties. They do, however, take stances on specific issues. And after doing countless voter registration drives and other events, they realized that there's a whole variety of people from all walks of life in this country that don't really know the basics about government at the national, state, or local level. Now, maybe you've never had a civics class or anything related to that, or maybe you've just forgotten what you learned because it was a while ago. This happens to even some of our league members. So we hope this series will remedy some of those gaps in information. Now, this series is funded in part by a grant from the Delaware Humanities. So let's talk a little bit more in depth about what exactly we're talking about related to the U.S. Congress. This is our national legislature, meaning our national lawmaking branch. And Congress, by this I mean our two chambers that make up our national legislature, the House of Representatives and the Senate. This is a largely misunderstood topic, certainly about what they do and what their role is, yet we are expected as citizens to vote for them, to understand what they're talking about, to understand national issues and policies, the impact of laws that they make at the national level, which significantly affect our lives, whether they're surrounding healthcare, taxes, the financial system, student loans, and a whole myriad of other issues. So today we're going to look a little bit more at the basics of structure, membership, their role and powers, and come up with some more ideas of what hopefully could keep more accountability and more education and awareness surrounding our national legislative branch. The bill to law process will be covered in a separate segment because that takes a little more time to explain. So if we look back to the Constitution, which is where I like to start all topics, and look at what the framers were doing and their ideals as they approached this new structure of government, all of the information on our national legislature and its foundation is found in Article 1. This is the first one in the U.S. Constitution, right after the preamble, and it's the longest and has the most detail of any of the other national branches included in the Constitution. The presidency in Article 2 and the judiciary in Article 3. And at the Constitutional Convention back in 1787 in Philadelphia, the role of the national legislature, among many other issues, was very contentious. And there were a lot of major divides that impacted what we ended up with among the various delegates there. Big states versus small states, North and South, people that favored a stronger national government versus those that wanted stronger state powers, and slave states versus non-slaveholding states. And one of the underlying ideals or concerns of the framers was a deep-seated fear of concentrated power. And so they focused a lot more on dilution and certainly the power of the national legislature instead of having an all-powerful unitary executive. And they knew they wanted a bicameral legislature, and this means it has two chambers in the legislature. And so this, among the variety of plans and ideas for structure, all the debates they had over composition, how members were chosen, the numbers, all reflect these concerns and these debates. So if we look actually at our House of Representatives and our Senate, and we look generally at their demographics, they are often and have long been generally whiter, older, more male, and significantly wealthier than the general population. Now, this has changed and evolved over time, and it changes faster in the House than in the Senate. largely because the House members are younger and they have shorter terms, so that the change in the turnover is a little more rapid. Now let's look a little more specifically at the House of Representatives. To be in the House of Representatives, to get elected to it, you need to be at least 25 years old. You need to have been a citizen of the U.S. for at least 7 years, and you need to be a resident of the district from which you are elected. Representatives serve 2-year terms, and the numbers from each state are based on the population of the state. There is actually a formula in Article 1 which details how you are supposed to allot how many representatives each state gets. In that formula, there's also the first compromise related to slavery that does appear in the U.S. Constitution. This is known as the 3/5 Compromise, and it did significantly, at least in the first few decades, affect the apportionment of how many representatives some states had versus some others. Although this compromise is remedied after the Civil War with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. There are 435 total people in the House of Representatives when all the seats are filled. It has been this number since 1930, when Congress decided that this was a good number to stop at. If you actually factored in the entire U.S. population, you would have a lot more people using this formula in Article 1, but 435 is where we have been since the 1930s. The re-election rate is worth mentioning. We re-elect members to the House at about 90 to 95%. So again, even though there's more turnover and it's a little faster in the House, it's still pretty darn slow. In addition to these 435 elected voting members, there are several other people that are present in the House that can often participate in debate and yet do not get a vote. These are the resident commissioner of Puerto Rico, and then delegates from our other territories. Guam, the American Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and the Northern Mariana Islands. So if we look at, in contrast, look at the Senate in a little bit more detail, the framers considered this the more elite chamber. They expected it would be more heady debate, longer terms. For example, the framers, when we first set out as a country, we did not directly elect our U.S. senators. While we vote for them today, up until the early 20th century, changed in 1913 with the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, is that state legislatures actually chose these senators, again giving that little bit more distance and making it a little more serious and a little more elite. But again, we vote for them directly now. If you want to be in the U.S. Senate, you need to be at least 30 years old. You need to have been a U.S. citizen for at least 9 years, and you need to live in the state from which you are elected. Senators serve 6-year terms. This means that when we have national elections every 2 years, that 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election. There are 2 senators per state for 100 total, and this is regardless of the size of the state. Again, this was one of the compromises that helped out the small states, so that it's emerged, as an issue in recent decades, where you have states like California with a huge population and little states like Delaware with a smaller population, and they both only have 2 senators. So some citizens might not feel as well represented in bigger states with higher populations. If we look a little bit more in depth at the leadership, so beyond these demographics of who, age, and qualifications, and look at leadership, which does favor the party with more members and is organized this way. In the House, we have the Speaker. The Speaker of the House is the top leadership role, elected by the members, and is a member of the party in the majority. You do not, one of those interesting little constitutional facts is, you do not actually have to be a member of the House to be chosen Speaker, but it has always been, and I don't foresee any time when that would not happen. If we look at the top leadership in the Senate, the Vice President constitutionally is the President of the Senate. That's part of checks and balances. Although in reality, this is largely ceremonial, and the vice president can only vote in cases of a tie. So they're not really there that much. So the Constitution built in another role, the president pro tempore, or president pro tem. This means the president for the time. And again, this is a largely symbolic role. This role in the last several decades has gone to the longest continually serving member of the party in the majority. In reality, day-to-day discussion and debate is rotated amongst junior senators to give them a little more leadership experience and give them a little more exposure and the ability for their home constituents to see them on the national stage. Both parties have majority leaders. These are the leaders of the party that has the most members. And again, their role is promoting the agenda of of their particular party. There are also minority leaders. Again, these are the party that has the less members, but nonetheless, they still have an agenda and they still work to advance their causes and their members. They also have whips, and it's kind of what it sounds like. They whip together their members in each various party. So there are Democratic whips and Republican whips. And their job is, when there's a big issue coming up, a big vote, they try to get all the members of their party all whipped together and everybody on party lines and on message and focused. Additionally, whichever party is in the majority, they also chair all of the committees and provide all the committee chairs. The person in the minority party that has the top position in a committee is called the ranking member. So beyond these leadership roles and demographics, what actually are the powers and what actually is the role of our U.S. Congress? Let's go back to the Constitution again. These are all detailed in Article 1, Section 8. Additionally, in Section 9 of Article 1, we have constraints on their power. So there are also restrictions, again, part of checks and balances, and a fear of too much power being vested in any one area. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about these powers and reflecting the concerns of the framers, and a lot played out in what they saw among the Articles of Confederation. This was the first attempt at a national government after the Revolution, and largely not very successful. Was considered pretty weak, didn't have any money, and didn't really have the ability to get anything done. So a lot of what shows up in the powers of Congress are things that were direct concerns among them, or other concerns that they had had related to being a colonial power related to Great Britain. So we have commerce, the commerce power, both interstate and among the Indian tribes. We also have the power of taxation. This is to pay for government, and certainly at the time, one of the big concerns was paying for Revolutionary War debt. These two, commerce and taxation, represent two of the biggest areas of expansion for Congress over time. They get very creative of claiming that a lot of things fall within those powers. Even things that may seem unrelated, as domestic violence or guns in school zones, they argue fall under areas of commerce and taxation. Congress also has the ability to borrow money and pay debts on the credit of the U.S. At the national level, they can go into a deficit, meaning that they have less money, or they've spent more money than they have, so they have less around. Not the case in the state level, but nonetheless, being able to borrow money, pay debts on the credit of the U.S. is certainly a huge role. They also have the role of establishing a system to oversee immigration and naturalization in this country, to declare war. A huge power, one might think, although the last time that the U.S. declared war was World War II. That was the last official declaration of war, although we've been in a lot of conflicts over the ensuing decades that have either been large enough or have been called wars. They establish uniform weights and measures. Congress can establish post offices and postal roads. This is why if someone steals your mail out of your mailbox, it is considered a federal crime. They also govern the District of Columbia, and this is laid out even what the dimensions of the District of Columbia, our nation's capital. While it functions as a city and has its own city government, it is ultimately overseen by Congress and does get the bulk of its budget from congressional appropriation. And the last part in the powers is the necessary and proper clause. This is often referred to as the loophole or the elastic clause, and this basically says that anything else related to the function of carrying out the powers that were listed before that they can do. And this falls into the area of what are called implied powers. Like anything else they need to do to carry out the rest of these, they can do. And so this again has allowed a lot more expansion in congressional role and a lot of involvement in areas that one might otherwise not think their area, particularly in American citizens' lives, private lives, and the economy. As I mentioned, conversely, Section 9 in Article 1 gets into the limits on congressional power. And these are also very interesting, to note, because again, some of these are hallmarks of our American system and our beliefs. So this first one represents the second compromise related to slavery that appears in the Constitution. This says that slave trade is prohibited after 1808. It does not ban slavery because that would not have been acceptable to slaveholding in southern states, but nonetheless was meant to ideally impact it and predict its demise over time. There's a provision for habeas corpus. This is your ability to be brought in front of a judge and told what you're accused of, to not be thrown in prison forever with no charges or no anything else. Congress cannot grant bills of attainder. Basically, this relates to and says that you cannot be declared guilty and punished without a trial. Congress cannot make ex post facto laws. They cannot punish you and make you guilty for something after the fact. If it was not illegal when you did it, yet they make a law later, you're not guilty. They can also not establish interstate tariffs. So they cannot make it so that you have to pay to trade, say, between, Virginia and Nebraska. They cannot prefer any port over another. They can only spend money after there has been a legal appropriations process, and they must keep detailed records and publish them regularly. This is meant to enhance government transparency so that citizens can actually see what's going on and how money is spent. They cannot grant titles of nobility. Not a big issue today, but was a big issue at the time. And they cannot impose direct taxes unless they're in proportion to an official census. This has undergone some evolution and change over time, but the foundation and what a direct tax is still a subject of major debate in a lot of circles. So how do they do all this? How do 435 individuals in the House or 100 in the Senate do all of these things? Well, most of the work of Congress is actually done by staff and then at the committee level and by some of the agencies of Congress. Now, all members serve on committees. Some may serve on several. Not all committees are equal. Some are more prominent than others, such as, say, the Senate Intelligence Committee or even the Senate Judiciary Committee. Some may have multiple subcommittees depending on their workload or if they have several areas of focus. There are 4 basic types of committees in Congress, and the first type are standing committees. These do the basic business of Congress, and they're always there. These are things like the Rules Committee in the House, or the Ways and Means Committee, or the Senate Appropriations Committee. The second type are select committees. These are often also called special committees. They focus on specific topics, and sometimes they can be temporary and go away when they're no longer needed. But some are permanent and stay on after, decades and decades of existence. A couple of examples of permanent special or select committees are the Senate Committee on Intelligence or the Senate Committee on Aging. A couple of temporary ones, for example, are the Special Select Committee on 9/11 or the Special Select Committee on Hurricane Sandy. The third type of committees are joint committees. These have membership from both the House and the Senate. And these are typically things, there's only a handful of them, that have a combined interest or function. These are things like printing or the Library of Congress. The fourth type of committee is the conference committee. Now this is a temporary committee all the time, and it's part of the bill to law process. So when a bill goes through both the House and the Senate, which it must do to go through, the entire process, sometimes the version that comes out of the House and the version that comes out of the Senate are very different. But you can only send one to the president for signature. This is where the conference committee comes in. Pull members from the House, members from the Senate, and they get together and hash out the differences and come up with a final version, which generally both chambers accept. Not always, but generally, because they know it's better than starting all over again. And then when they've done their work, the committee goes away. In addition to the committee work, there are also 3 permanent agencies that help out Congress with their work. These are all nonpartisan. The first is the CRS, or the Congressional Research Service. And they do research on issues and bills for members of Congress. And the big key of their work is that it's confidential. So while they may be working on things in their own offices and with their own staff, it is not always fully confidential, but if they do the research through the CRS, it will be until they are ready to introduce their ideas and proposals to the world. The second is the GAO, or the Government Accountability Office. And they study programs and expenditures of the federal budget to determine their success over time and whether they're actually meeting their goals. And they publish reports and make recommendations. Congress can choose to follow or not follow these, but nonetheless they put the data out there. And the third is the CBO, or the Congressional Budget Office. And they study and monitor our federal budget. And they make predictions, and they make economic forecasts, and they also do something called scoring legislation, which is where they estimate the cost and other impacts of a proposed piece of legislation before it even happens, so that members of Congress can better understand what the impact might be. So this is a lot at the national level. In addition to all this, but wait, there's more. A member must be concerned about what's going on in their own home state or district. So what they do at the national level, this is often called Hill style. And what they do in their home state or district is called home style. Now every member has at least one, and sometimes multiple, depending on the size of the state and their constituency, offices in their home state and district. And they generally deal with national issues in their DC office, and then they deal with more state and local issues in their district or state offices. And one thing that as they come to deal with their home style is, how do I represent my constituents? And there are 2 kind of camps that this falls into. First is a delegate. Does the representative or senator act as a delegate who is delegated to directly reflect the views of the voters in their district, exactly what they want? Or are they supposed to act as a trustee where the voters will entrust them with making the right decision and representing their ideas on the national level? In reality, no one adheres to one solely or the other. You really have to do a mix. Although some fall, more heavily on one side than the other, you do need to listen to the members of your district or of your state, because they're the people who vote to re-elect you. So you got to look like you're paying attention. And on the other side, it's not really practical to get input and voter sentiment on every single issue or decision. So you do have to act as a trustee as well. in addition to figuring out how they're going to work at that national level when they're in their home state or district, and they do have specific recesses and breaks during the congressional year to allow them to do this. They attend other events. They attend a whole variety of events. They may support other candidates that are running for office from their party in their state or district. They may engage in their own re-election campaigning, which they are always doing because the amounts of money and voter awareness and all of that you need in our modern era do foster an era of constant campaigning. They need to fundraise. Again, they need a lot of money to do these things. They can help to bring attention to, prioritize, or focus on state and local issues. And one of the big things that they are often looked at for is that they can bring money and projects home from the national budget to their state either or their district. They also recommend candidates for the National Service Academies, and by this, this is a role for senators, and by this I mean like the Air Force Academy or the Military Academy at West Point. So, one of the concerns about Congress, and this is something that members are aware of and that citizens often can become aware of, is that a lot of people don't like Congress. Generally has the lowest approval ratings of any of the three national branches. Yet, interestingly, most members love their own representative or senator. They'll think that their own representative or senator is doing a great job representing them, but it's all the others that have a problem and, need to be cycled out. And so we re-elect our own representatives and senators 90 to 95% of the time. And so that this fosters, little time for change and innovation. Most people also misunderstand the power and influence of other key actors on their particular representative and senator. In addition to what voters want, there's a lot of other pressure on them. Certainly the major political parties put pressure on them to either vote a certain way, or to campaign a certain way, or to act in a certain way at the national level. That's a huge pressure, particularly if they want money and help in their re-election campaign. There's also the impact of powerful industries. Powerful corporations, that they want laws that are made to favor their particular industry or their particular business. Wealthy individuals who will make sizable campaign contributions for their issue being addressed or their particular perspective being acknowledged. And then there are also outside powerful interest groups, which can often have millions and millions of members and a lot of money and be a very, very powerful impact on whether someone, gets reelected or not. For example, it's worth pointing out that one of the strongest interest groups in this country is the NRA, the National Rifle Association. They have a lot of members and they have a lot of money. They have a lot of influence on members of the legislature, particularly of the Republican Party. And their grades and scorecards that they give on the behavior and the performance of particular representatives and senators can mean whether that person gets reelected or not. So just an example of the strength and power of some of these outside actors. One of the most common criticisms of our national legislature is that they get nothing done. And this is often measured by many as, in how many laws they get passed, or how many hearings they do, or whether they solve issues, or whether they, come together and prevent something from happening. I would argue that this is a very flawed measurement, because it would mean that you would just be passing tons and tons of laws all the time, and that's not realistic to enforce all those. And it's not really compatible with the idea and role and scope of our national government. we focus on a 2- and 4-year election cycle, so you just cannot address everything and get it done in 2 or 4 years. Some of these issues take a very long time to solve. And also, some people's approach may actually be that it's better to pass less laws and have less laws and less regulation and less national government oversight. So the get nothing done argument is a very, very difficult one and shows a lot of misunderstanding. And also Congress tends to push a lot of issues down the road to the next election cycle when they might not have to deal with them or at least confront it, to their voters at this particular time. So in looking at all of these basics of the congressional structure, what their powers are, how, who is in their membership, what they actually do, and some of the other obstacles they face, we realize that, again, much more voter and citizen education is essential. And this would help with more accountability of understanding them and understanding what they're doing and understanding what messages they give you so that you know whether, they are being honest and upfront with you. So things that we could do besides education. The power of incumbency is certainly something that could be addressed. Again, re-electing people over 90% of the time, you don't have a lot of change and turnover. It does not allow for people from other movements, third and minor parties, etc. We could impose term limits. And I say we, but this would really be much more of something that would have to happen and the genesis of it with the national legislature. Even if it started at the state level, the national legislature has to vote on constitutional amendments, and this would be like putting an end date on their job, and why would they do that? So not a lot of momentum toward national term limits. Could reduce the costs associated with campaigns. The average Senate campaign in a large state that's hotly contested can run $60 million or more. That's a huge amount of money. And again, reduces the ability of other people that might be interested in running and holding these offices from being successful. We could certainly try to address the impact of some of these outside actors, these interest groups, powerful industries that can, by campaign contributions, scorecards, these other things, certainly sway their behavior more than the actual voters and citizens they represent. And then we could spend more time learning about and addressing the complexity of issues and politics in this country. This can even take several terms for the representatives and senators to master on their own. So hopefully this has given you a little bit of information to better understand our national legislature, our U.S. Congress, and its structure, membership, and role. I thank you very much for your time.